Thanks so much for joining everyone today. Welcome to our panel, On the Scene, Journalism, Science, and Media, brought to you by the Science Communication Committee at the National Science Policy Network, also known as NSPN. We're absolutely thrilled today to ask experts on what it takes to share science to mass audiences within today's evolving media and journalistic landscapes. And if you're not familiar with NSPN, NSPN is an organization designed for early career STEM professionals who wish to engage in science communication, policy, diplomacy, and more. So we welcome you to connect with us and our panelists if you wish to learn more about NSPN or today's event. Before jumping in, I'd just like to introduce our team. I'm Andrea Thompson. I'm currently chair of the Science Communication Committee at NSPN, and I'm a data scientist at the Pacific Northwest National Laboratory. Our external vice chair, Chiungwei Huang, is a PhD candidate in microbiology at UC Berkeley and has been our major creative force in finding where exciting science communication is happening beyond NSPN. We also had Chiungwei Huang is our internal vice chair and a PhD candidate in medical neuroscience at Indiana University, and she has recently helped launch our SciComm 101 event on African diaspora scientists. So they are really, really fantastic people to work with. That being said, your moderator today will be Eleanor Wang, currently in their third year as a microbiology PhD student at UC Berkeley. They study how archaea make and use nutrients. Prior to starting graduate school, they went to UC San Diego for their undergraduate studies, where they first developed an interest in science journalism, illustration, education, and policy. Outside of science, they create illustrations with a wide range of different media. And if you are interested in seeing their work, please feel free to contact them. And with that, I'll turn it over to Eleanor to introduce our speakers.
Thank you so much. And so I'll start introducing our speakers, starting from left to right. And so first we have Dr. Chiungwei Huang, who is a chemist and science writer. Originally from Taiwan, she ventured to the US to earn her PhD in physical chemistry at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. Currently, she works as a research scientist for Eastman Chemical Company, where she develops analysis methods to support materials and product innovation. Chiungwei also leads inclusion and diversity initiatives within the company, overseeing content creation and communication. And beyond her corporate endeavors, Chiungwei directs media engagement for the Journal of Science Policy Governance, bridging the gap between media and science policy research. She was a 2022 AAAS Mass Media Science Engineering Fellow and has been reporting about science for the public for various publications. As a minority first-generation immigrant and mother in science, Chiungwei often shares her journey on her personal blog and social media to help others in her community navigate similar challenges. Next, we have Andrea Thompson. Andrea Thompson is an associate editor covering the environment, energy, and earth sciences. She has been covering these issues for 15 years, and prior to joining the Scientific American, she was a senior writer covering climate science at Climate Central and a reporter and editor at Live Science, where she primarily covered earth science and the environment. She has moderated panels, including programs as part of the United Nations Sustainable Development Media Zone, and appeared in radio and television interviews on major networks. She holds a graduate degree in science, health, and environmental reporting from New York University, as well as bachelor's and master's degrees in atmospheric chemistry from the Georgia Institute of Technology. And now, last but not least, we have Maddie Sofia, who is a scientist and journalist. Their journalism career began at NPR in 2016, and in 2019, Maddie became the founding host of NPR's award-winning daily science podcast, Shortwave. In 2020, Shortwave became the most popular science podcast on Spotify in the United States. Maddie's work centers on inclusive communication and increasing the representation of marginalized communities in science journalism. They have reported on COVID, inequities in academia and public health, and some of the Earth's most fascinating creepy crawlies. They are particularly interested in highlighting queer voices and issues. And before joining Shortwave, before hosting Shortwave, Maddie hosted NPR video show Maddie About Science and co-developed the worldwide NPR SciCommers program. The program, now at Boston University, focuses on supporting scientists interested in science communication through mentorship, community, and editorial support. And previous to NPR, they earned their PhD in microbiology and immunology from the University of Rochester Medical Center. And so thank you all so much for being here. I am incredibly grateful to be in the presence of such incredible science communicators. I've been listening to Shortwave for a good number of years now, and am also like have a vested interest in the AAAF like Mass Media Fellowship. But and also climate is like one of my pet interests, and so this is kind of biased towards some of my own personal interests a little bit, to be honest. But anyhow, yeah, thank you all so much for being here. Okay,
Thank
and
you, Elena.
so yeah, and so our first question kind of is focused a lot on personal journeys. So it essentially is what has been your personal journey in science journalism, media, and or podcasting? And so, for instance, what brought you into these fields? What were some of the hard decisions that you've had to make during your career? And how have those kind of impacted where you are now? And which moments were like really exciting and which ones felt like kind of more daunting? Um, and so, for instance, maybe you could tell us about what one of your favorite science stories that you told and why are. And yeah, without further ado, I guess I'll point to each of you to start so we don't have the awkward, like, who's going to talk first. And so let's start with Andrea.
Sure. So I went to college, intending to study science, go into that field. My interests sort of changed as through my college career. I sort of started in physics, and then changed over to earth sciences and really, particularly meteorology and atmospheric chemistry. And when I was really going into my master's, but particularly doing it, I sort of figured out that I liked telling people about the things I was learning more than I liked being stuck in the lab. That that's where sort of my interest was. And I had done some sort of, low-key journalism. I was on the college yearbook and newspaper. So I had some intro to it. And I sort of looked around and found the program at NYU on graduate studies in science reporting, and it seemed a perfect fit. So I went there and found I really liked it. I went through a series of internships. I actually interned at Science Friday. I interned with some Scholastics kids magazines, and then with Life Science, where I ended up getting a job. I've largely covered environment and earth stuff because that's where my background was. But particularly Life Science sort of covered anything and everything under the sun. And ended up deciding, I really wanted to specialize more in environment and climate. So I went to Climate Central, then ended up at SciAm, where I, have broadened back out a little bit again, but, not as much as at Life Science. So, still a heavy climate focus. And I'd say of some of one of the most exciting things I've gotten to do was actually at Life Science and the sister site space.com, where I reported to. I got to go to the Jet Propulsion Laboratory for the landing of the Phoenix Mars lander, which was really, really exciting to get to be there in person. Yeah, that was definitely a personal career highlight. And then I think, some of the ones I'm most proud of in terms of stories, it's, we're 15 years, I've written so many, it's hard to remember them all. I did, not long after I started at Scientific American, I actually did a 3-part series on microplastics. And it was sort of before they had become a really big topic and sort of wider in the wider public mind. And it was just this fascinating, dive into this world of, that we had no idea or very little idea of how much of this pollution was out there, really just beginning to get a grasp on it. And I've been following that since, but that was a series where I spent, several months reporting. I read, a stack of papers this big to sort of see where we were at, and was pretty proud of that. And I've continued covering that since then, and it's sort of become one of my beats here. But yeah, I think that's kind of a nutshell.
Wow, that's really incredible. Yeah, I guess also a lot of the panelists here, or all of our panelists here, have transitioned from careers in science into journalism and have covered a lot of really like wide-ranging topics. And so next I'll turn it over to Chiungwei to talk about her personal story and personal journey in science journalism.
Yeah, sure.
So I'll say my passion in science writing particularly is kind of a refound passion. Because when I remember when I was little, like 5th, 6th grade, just one day I decided to sign myself up to a essay competition, which, at the time we have no internet. I just read on the newspaper and there's a competition, record, I want to write something. And then I sent it out and magically I got some award. And so that's kind of the starting point. My parents and teachers at the school at the time had no idea why this girl just decided to do that, but I did do that. I did that. And then, but it kind of winding down that passion, because when I actually went into study science, engineering in that particular field in the later education, that kind of writing stuff just kind of just be put in the back burner. And I never thought about that because the science and engineering stuff just overwhelming, heavy, and trying to understand and trying to break into the field. So that just continue. I get my education, I get my degree, and I work into the industry. And then until I refound that thing when I went into the grad school, and when I went into just to study overseas. So I moved from Taiwan to United States 2015. And as the first year graduate student, it's very overwhelming. And as I trying to understand all the things, and one day I read through the email, and then I found this email writing around my email box. And so my department was trying to find a student who is interested in writing about science, particularly about to kind of opportunity for students to write about the institution, the department's research. I was like, aha, this is something called science writing. I have a background in science and I have my old passion in writing. I have no idea that two things can be combined. So that's the point I got started very interested in science writing and science communication, because I don't think there's a thing or was very popular when I grew up in my country. And now there's more like a popular and people starting to learn about that field. So from there, I started to find more, just kind of see that, hey, I'm interested in that. Do you have opportunity for me to write? So I started with the blogging with the science and writing and communication club at the university, and then trying to seek out other research institute. And next year, I actually got into the writer position that I first saw in my email in my first year. And then going to reach out and network in the conference, trying to cover the science at the conference. So that's just evolved, and then getting more into leadership position at the university, or reach out and started to get involved in Comm. There's a science communication workshop nationwide, and then we have local region chapter in North Carolina as well. So get involved that, and then evolve. So kind of overall experience that bring me to more formal newsroom experience. So I applied to scholarship at my university, and then so I went into the local newsroom to start to get into the feel of what a formal and professional journalism look like and how they do things and work on the work stream. And then last year, I applied to Chiungwei Mass Media Fellowship, and got in, and then I was placed in the North Carolina Raleigh News Observer, and I got a full-time 3 months, really experiencing that experience. So I still love that passion, and I love that exercise. I love the mission behind that. So I'm still trying to do more freelance writing and get connected with the community as for today. So that's me.
Sounds like an incredible journey. Yeah, I feel like even though science communication is becoming more popular, I feel like I'm still meeting a lot of people who are like either applying for grad school or like early on in their grad school career who like don't know too much about what kind of areas are available to them. So yeah, and now I'll pass it to Maddie.
Okay. Hey y'all, thank you for coming. Yeah, so I'm Maddie. I started as a scientist. I was in graduate school, and those first couple of years of graduate school, if y'all have experienced them, are very dark and twisty, and it really makes you look in the mirror and say, what do I want to do with my life? And for me, giving baby mice cholera and crying alone in the dark room wasn't the answer for me. So I was like, God, this is awful. I'm feeling very isolated. I did not enjoy the culture of academia, although I think it took leaving that culture to really understand what all that discomfort was. And then Joe Palca, who's an retired NPR science correspondent, came to Rochester and gave a talk about science journalism. And I was like, oh, this is it. Like, this is my thing. Because like Andrea mentioned, I really enjoy talking about science and helping people like communicate their science. I had a bunch of super nerds around me and they were very passionate and they did want to give baby mice cholera their whole life, but it was very difficult to understand like what they were talking about. So we started kind of like an informal journal club just to deal with the emotional toll of having like old men tell you what you did wrong at the end of a presentation and make you doubt yourself for years. So we started this kind of like informal club and I really enjoyed the training aspect of it. And I got some money from a dean to bring in the Alan Alda Center for Science Communication. And they were like, look at this kid trying so hard that doesn't know what they're doing. And they kind of took me in for a little bit. And I got to do some of their trainings and started teaching with them. And I kept in touch with Joe Palca, and he was starting a science communication kind of mentorship program at NPR. And it was not anything to do with journalism. It was specifically focused on building a community that helps scientists start to communicate with non-academics. About that program became like wildly popular because there was such a need for scientists to have a place to connect. I strongly suggest, reaching out to that program at BU. We helped over 100 scientists get published outside of academia in places like Scientific American. So I was really enjoying that training, but I was kind of dabbling in journalism while I was doing it and really liking it. And somebody had asked, there was like, you talk about like these little like points of transition. If there's anybody who wanted to do live science demonstrations on Facebook for NPR's audience, so like hundreds of thousands of people looking at you doing a live science demonstration. And I still remember Nell Greenfield Boyce, who's one of my favorite reporters at NPR, looking at this like young group of video producers and telling them that is literally the worst idea she has ever heard. And I was like, I'll do it. Because Joe was like, just do everything, try everything. And they were like, look at this little science clown. And I ended up like testing weirdly well on camera. I started doing video, and then I was like kind of really getting into it. And I was working with SACNAS, the Society for the Advancement of Chicano Native American Scientists, and really like trying to look around at the newsroom, and you can look around at any newsroom really and see this, and just see who they're putting on as their scientists. And at the time, it was 75% white folks, and somehow in the year of our Lord 2020, 65% men. And so I started with Nell and a lot of reporters who had been there for years, trying to rethink, okay, who are we putting on the radio in the name of science? Who do we think is experts? Why do we think that they're experts? And how do we change that? And so that kind of led to, I think, a big change on the science desk. Like I said, people have been doing it before me, but I was really committed to it. And when NPR decided that NPR is one of the largest science desks in the country, I think just behind the Times maybe, that we had a really great science desk, that we had a lot of people listen to science stories on NPR, but it was for an audience that was not the audience that they wanted to move towards, which is a younger, more diverse audience. And so they basically gave somebody with no experience, I had never been on like Morning Edition, or maybe I'd been on it once, the opportunity to host. And so I hosted that show with Emily Huang. And that show was really about changing the way science stories are told, specifically who the people are, what the lens is, and this inclusive communication lens, which I'm happy to talk about more. That show, about 4 months after we launched it, the pandemic hit. I am also a microbiologist, so I was also our COVID reporter. And so it went from, us talking about like bugs to like, now I'm talking to 800,000 people about 15 different preprints that I have read. And because I'm a microbiologist, I was one of NPR's major COVID reporters. And it led to another juncture where, I had gone from crying alone in the dark room to having my dream job, being at the largest podcast provider with one of the most popular shows, feeling like, wow, I really made it. This is what I want to do. But working 65 hours a week, not like having a hard time sleeping, having a hard time divesting from the news. When you're on a breaking daily news show, your life kind of just becomes that thing. And after 2 years and a lot of systemic managerial failure at NPR, which I'm happy to talk about as well, since I don't work there anymore, a lot of people left NPR around that time, and I was one of them. And so now I am in that, and I'm happy to talk about those kinds of big transition moments because I think it's important to talk about them. But that was the most difficult decision I've ever made, and also a very good one. And now I mainly do some freelancing. I really like working with the Science Friday folks. So I host Science Friday sometimes when Ira's tired. And now I also have gotten back into kind of more teaching. So because I'm a scientist, turned into a journalist, I talk to scientists about working with journalists. I talk to scientists about working with community members. And my focus there, again, is personal belief systems, identity, and how we connect with people around their identity to help them make decisions about science. And so, yeah, that's what I'm up to now.
Yeah. No, yeah, the way that you like frame stories and our understanding of like people, their relationship to science and our identities like has such a big influence on like how the science gets understood and how it gets told to the public and what people do with that information. And this kind of like leads really well into our next question, which is centers around how we approach breaking science stories and developing them. And so like science communication can really easily be mistaken to be like a really catch-all term for things from like journalism and podcasting, which is really different from like scientists who communicate science to other scientists. And so how would you describe the approaches or disciplinary principles that you take from breaking and when you're breaking and developing science stories? So likewise, from ideation to press release, like would y'all be able to like walk through your story development and production logistics? And so like who are you working with most? Like how do you go about co-creating those stories? Like what roles do each of you play in those processes, and how long does it take to develop and release those stories? Like, do y'all have like a consistent target audience, or does it kind of like vary project to project? And how do you choose who to go to when you need expert opinions? So because this leads so well into what Maddie was just talking about, I'll let you continue by answering this question.
Sure. I'd like to point out, and Eleanor and I are friends, so I can say this, that you asked me 7 questions in there, so I'll pick the ones I feel the most confident in. I will say that every story is different. There are certain types of story that are similar. So like, let's say the most boring one for me, let's say a new journal article comes out and it's got something in it. I would read that dear Lord. I would read that journal article. I would call 1 or 2 of the authors. I would look through the introduction to find outside authors or people that are similarly positioned in the field or experts to ask them for their opinion quickly on the piece. Then I would do a series of interviews with the authors. Producers would cut that together and, potentially if it's like an interview style, it'd be a conversation between me and them and it would go out. If it's like a story where a man went after a fossil hunter in Morocco to find a fossil that he saw once 15 years ago, then I'm like, okay, this is like a yarn and a story and a narrative. And then we would spend hours building a narrative and working with a scientist to make sure that this happened and then this happened and this happened. If we're going to make it like a mystery story, if it's about somebody's personal identity, like for example, one of my favorite stories I've ever worked on was not a hard-hitting news story, but in fact, it was an interview I did with Sally Ride, who was the first American woman in space, who is also a queer person. And I had a conversation with their partner about being essentially in a long-term relationship with Sally Ride and closeted for 30 years. And the way that I approached that interview is very different because now I'm talking to a person about their life and I'm reading every interview they've ever done. And I'm spending multiple different interviews with them, talking to them, building confidence, building trust, and then having a really, really present in the moment, unplanned conversation. So, it changes, but I think the really important things that for any story is what are we trying to say? Whose vantage point are we talking about it from? and who do we pick to talk about it? And so those are kind of the important things that I'm always thinking. And then the last thing is, who am I? What is my relationship to these different groups of people? What are my biases bringing into this? And that's reflexivity, and that's something that comes with time.
Yeah. I remember sitting in the tissue culture room while listening to the episode on Sally Ride crying.
Good.
Yeah,
the point
I
of that
think
was to make our audience cry. So I'm glad that that's what you shouldn't have felt empowered. You
we're-
should have just felt sad. So yeah, good.
But yeah, I would be really curious because I feel like from different platforms, not all of them involve doing interviews and not all of them have the same capacity. Like, yeah, I think depending on the pace of how quickly you need to get stories out and like resources and like who you're working with, like some of those like research processes and like reaching out to sources like can look really different. So Chiungwei, would you be able to talk about your process?
Yeah, so I kind of have depends on the phase of my life now, and I kind of doing different things. So currently I do more freelancing, but most like, as Maddie said, like a boring pieces, because that's the capacity I can take on. So it's like a journal comes out, a research comes out, and I will help to craft a news press or interview the author and the outside expert to kind of assess what's the novelty of that journal. And I remember there's in the past, in my previous mass media, triple S media fellowship, and my prior newsroom experience, it's more like a building the narrative story look like. So it's not necessarily a new journal comes out, but it's like a generally what's the newsworthy to dig into, or there's a very high profile person doing very important vaccine development discovery, and can we frame it as an important work, and how is the person is influencing the next generation of scientists as well. And I would say my approach, and kind of echo Maddie has said, is what's the most important things we were trying to convey. Sometimes it's not necessarily equal to what a scientist see, because you are a scientist, there's a field that's important, there will be important journal that comes out that impact your field, but that's not necessarily would be translated to how is that related to more general audience look like. So I think that the one thing is more is to what's the messaging look like, and then to come down to, as a journalist, how and why do you want to report that study, is to stay curious, be curious about that, and stay with that research a little bit while, because at first you might see this seems to be nothing I can do about the journal, because I cannot see the pitch point. How do I pitch to an editor? How do I convince my editor to let me to write about the story? And one specific example for that is, so last year I was in North Carolina, and Raleigh and News Observer, they are a local newsroom. So the audience care about what happened in North Carolina, and why is that national event could be relevant to my daily life, because you think about that newspaper is on the shelf of a Target or Walmart, and every day you go by, when you see the newspaper, what do you think of that? It's not necessary to be relevant to my daily life. I'm so busy and just a random person. So last summer, it was a time when the James Webb telescope, the first image, and they launched that and take the first image, come back to scientists. And to me, it's like the most important things on Earth, maybe in the universe, right? Because that's a really improvement. So I was really, really interested in talking more about that. But at first, like I said, I haven't figured out how to convince my editor, just because it's new to the scientist and it's new to national popular science wise. So I kind of just tune in to the press release and watching out all the thing and see that, so that first the image is so shiny, sparkling stuff, and say, oh, great. And then down to the day, I was like, I didn't know what I can do with that. And then, so at the same day, at the night, I started to look around and I saw a professor. She's a astronomist. So her name is Katie Mack. She's popular in the area and very successful and impactful science communicator. So she recorded a YouTube video and kind of just she just translated what does the image really means, and which is not I heard from the news press, because news press is important, that's great, and but from Maddie's from her videos, like, oh no, I kind of understand what's the science behind that, because of the black hole and all the lengths, all the physics. It's not like a fancy video, but you can feel that the passion from her voice is like a little emotional. So it was like, oh, this is a great video. And I just pinned it in the Slack and send it to all the editors and to my editor and to my team members. And I kind of just say, look at that. She explained so great. And I believe you can understand that physics behind. And next day, I saw my editor say, Chiungwei, do you want to write about this? I was like, of course. You say so, even I'll take that, of course. And then it canceled another panic attack because it's a tight deadline. I want to try to get it out as soon as possible, but she's so busy. And do I even get a chance to interview her? Can I get the deadline on time within 2 days? And can I really write a good story so that's relevant to our local audience? So anyway, I did that. She replied to my email. I would get interviewed. I got on the Zoom next day. And another panic is like, I was nervous because I know her from years before when she was in the Comm conference, and she was like a role model to me. And I was just so nervous as a fan of her. So, well, anyway, there's a lot of emotions, and I think that piece of a story comes out. It's very meaningful for me just because stay curious with that and be patient with that, your curiosity. Let it sit a while and things kind of go out. And I also want to share that the story I did with that is my first front page newspaper feature. Exciting for me, it's like achievement for me, and I was like looking at that, just like I'm so proud of that. And since then, I think that's the emotional part, why you are curious about that, and stay with that. And there's an opportunity you share that passion with others as well.
My favorite part about that story is Chiungwei somehow got their editor to think it was their idea, which is peak science journalism. You're like, oh, you want me to write? Well, yeah, I mean, if you say so, I would love to write that story. Beautifully executed, Andrea. I'm sure you have feelings about that.
Yeah.
But I also like what you said, be patient with your curiosity. I wrote that down. I really like that because sometimes things feel so like news has an ability to make you feel like everything is urgent and important and right now. And the reality is you probably did a better story waiting a little bit, finding a good source, and then going from there and not doing something the day it came out or whatever. So I just think that's really important. And I love that. Stay curious. Patient with your curiosity.
Yeah, I can also very much relate to the sense that, like, especially as someone who's trying to, like, I'm still finishing out my PhD, but I'm trying to get into like a career in science communication. The idea of going from having folks who I look up to a lot in the SciComm field and then suddenly being like, well, in theory, if I end up going into journalism, I'm going to be working with my like heroes, or yeah, so it's very intimidating. And I think something else you mentioned earlier about how like trying to bridge the gap between how scientists understand their work and making it relevant to the public was also really interesting, because a lot of scientists, like we all sit in our little like labs and we have like micro communities where like you go to like conferences and you know who all the other scientists are like working in different fields, but like a lot of scientists don't even realize that those communities and how they interact with each other, like that's part of the story that needs to be broken to the public, or like it plays a force in that. And so I think, let's see, we have a few more questions, and I know Andrea, you like had to drop off for a second, but we were just talking about essentially like trying to keep up with the news cycle and it all feeling really urgent. And so, which really ties well into our next question, actually. And so this question is essentially just surrounding the idea that science itself is also a very dynamic, reactive, and an innovative system of knowledge. And so how do, or wait, hold on. Like essentially, like how do you keep up with what's happening in the world, and how do you handle like the pressure to tie that into your work? And like how does that tie into like how do you like interface with your editors? And yeah, and so you work at the Scientific American and have also worked with different like publishers before and different communities. And so Andrea, would you be able to answer that question first?
Sure. We Science, I think, we're not alone in this, but I think we're an interesting case because we do a lot of different types of journalism. So we do the daily news online. We have our monthly print magazine, and we do things like podcasting, videos, and all of those sort of have slightly different focuses and different relationships with the news cycle. So obviously, most of my work is online, and then in the daily news. So I have to be a bit more plugged in than, say, my colleagues who really more work on the feature print side. And some of that, changes based on like what's happening on a given day. When it's hurricane season, I have to be very plugged into, things that are happening. And there's, I wrote so many heat wave stories this summer. If you look at my like my story list on our site, it's heat wave, heat wave, heat wave. And so being really plugged into that, with something like COP28 happening right now, I am monitoring every day. I don't write daily news stories on that in the same way, in part just because our focus as Scientific American is more on the science than on the policy. And, not that we don't discuss policy, but, our audience isn't quite as interested in the nitty gritty of all of those international negotiations and stuff. So, but it's a tough balance to be aware of what's happening in the news, but also, but not being a slave to that news cycle, is really tricky. And I think it just, it honestly changes day to day. So like on today, I haven't actually been paying that much of attention to what's happening in the news, whereas, when wildfire smoke was encompassing New York, I was very, I was still on Twitter and some of the other places, and looking for constant updates, because we were trying to write and keep up with all of that. So it's something that's very dynamic, I think. But I think it is really important, because science is such an iterative process, and it's really easy to fall into the trap of big news study says X, and then not kind of giving people the context of that is sort of one step in a process most of the time. And I think, we, particularly at Scientific American, try and give people that context. So I will often try and do stories. An example is, was last week or the week before, what is time? Google came out saying that they have a new AI weather forecasting capabilities. And there was a lot of sort of daily news coverage of that. And we have a story coming hopefully in the next couple of weeks that's taking a step back from that and sort of putting that in a wider context, both in terms of the capabilities of AI and where the promise and perils are there, and explaining how weather forecasting actually works to people, because that's something that, weather impacts us all every day, but people don't actually have a lot of understanding of how weather forecasts are made, and honestly, how remarkably good they are. Like, it's astounding that we can do what we can do, and I don't think people have the appreciation of that. So that was an example where we decided, like, we don't need to have the daily try and compete on the daily cycle on that, because we have the expertise and the knowledge to sort of put that in the wider context for people. And which stories get which treatment, that might vary from editor to editor. That's a lot of these things, in journalism can be very subjective calls. You you could send a pitch to 5 different editors and get 5 completely different reactions on it. So, but that's, I think, as an institution, that's often the kind of tact we take is, how do we situate this for people and sort of put it in this broader context? So hopefully that helps answer.
It's like a lot of
Andrea, I think that's really cool. And I'm wondering what Chiungwei feels about this too, because, I worked in daily news, and science, like breaking news and science, I think are like the antithesis of each other, right? So like anybody who's been a scientist understands, like you were saying, Andrea, it's like really iterative, right? And slow and self-correcting, and you need context. And one thing I really struggled with, and why I've left the daily news beat and will not return to it, is the inability to both hit news deadlines, which I would argue are made up, and pressured from different news organizations, like versus being able to say like, okay, let's slow down, let's help people make sense of the world, versus like hit them with these little, like, this study says COVID can survive on surfaces. And then you have to be like, okay, well, let's take a second and be like, on Shortwave, we would say, let's take a second and say, like, survival is not infection. Let's talk about what makes an infectious dose. Let's talk about these things, versus when you have like, 2 minutes on Morning Edition and all you can say is 2 minutes. Like, how do you think about that as an editor? Because I find my push was like, hey, let's slow down. Like, let's help us make sense of this. But you've got like, advertising pressure and news pressure and like that kind of stuff. So you talk a little bit about that, because that's one thing that was the biggest surprise coming from science to journalism for me.
Yeah, it's a constant tension. And there's always, from the news cycle and competing against other outlets, from the perspective of trying to capture, your market of the audience and get because we live or die by how many people look at our material. That is the end all be all. Page views, unfortunately, are sort of the end all be all. Or I guess more accurately, the money you can make from those page views.
Right.
And it has, sometimes it's a very quick judgment. So in the example of those wildfires, that wildfire smoke event, that was one where, it made a lot of sense to have a very quick story, because you're like, this is only going to last a couple days and people are wondering what's happening now. So you're trying to answer a question people have in the moment. And, what we try to do is, we have our writers and editors, including a great stable of freelance writers, who we know kind of have that contextual knowledge. And, I'm in charge of the environment and earthbeat, and I don't have the depth of knowledge in every aspect of it. So I do try and have writers that I know geology really well, or some aspect. And like, for me, hurricanes is my jam. That's where I'm, I can write, I can just go to town writing right now on hurricanes. And so I know exactly what to ask, who to ask. And so it's very easy for me to do something very quickly on that. Other stories can be a little trickier. So there is often an internal deliberation of like, okay, is this something that warrants a really quick response, because people aren't going to be wondering this in 5 days? Is it something we can put out something quality in that time? And if so, what does that look like? So a lot of sometimes what we do is we do a Q&A with an expert, because we may not actually have the knowledge to do it ourselves, but like, I can identify someone, and a Q&A is a fairly low lift in terms of production and getting it done. You have to do a little less shaping of a story if you know what questions you're going to ask, and especially with some fairly good AI transcription tools that just drastically cut down on the time to transcribe. Transcribing was one of my most loathed activities before, and things have made it a lot easier. So yeah, I think it's and then even from the magazine perspective, we will sometimes say like, okay, we've seen a lot of talk about this thing, so maybe like carbon dioxide removal. We think it's time for a feature that kind of shows where we're at. So that can look a little different, and it's not, sometimes it is hard to make the case of like, no, we don't want to do the like quick response, just here's a study story. This is something where we need to give people the context. And I consider that a big part of my job is deciding which sort of route to take.
Yeah, I would say the work relationship between writer, journalist, and editor is particularly important in that context. because I consider myself a little fortunate because coming as a scientist, they didn't assign me as like a breaking out the daily news, but I did one time volunteer to do that, and I feel that overwhelming sense of deadline. Oh my God, I need to do that by tomorrow, and I was going out a night and one night or two, and so that's kind of a communication and work with the editor.
Sorry.
And no worries. And
I have a wild dog. I'm sorry.
That's cute. Yeah. So kind of and also as a journalist, I think one thing to think about is that consider where your strength is. And for example, you're just good at writing and get information out so quickly. So that's where you can come in. And for some people like me, I'm a little more like a more slow pace. I need time to think, to take that quality into consideration. So I don't necessarily want to get involved too heavily into that because I want to communicate. I want to convey my strength. It's not necessary to that. If you assign me to do that all the time, I will get burnout, and you don't get necessarily a win-win situation. So I think that's the relationship coming as important as well.
Yeah, that's where I looked out in the internships I had that I got the opportunity to do a lot of different styles of journalism and working on different timescales. And I discovered that while it can be really nice to have the time to do these, bigger features that really delve into a topic and explore them, that I am sort of my natural inclination is a little more the breaking news having a shorter deadline, that I just personally operate a little better with that kind of pressure. Otherwise I'm sort of like, I've got time to look at, versus if I know I'm on the deadline, I'm like, all right, let's do this. And that was something that I really appreciated, getting the chance to sort of figure out where the best fit for me was.
So while we're on the topic of like internships, like learning how to find your favorite like different news outlets, news styles, like and kind of like getting that sense of like, oh, how do these like writing styles like work for me? Like because a lot of us who are transitioning from like science into journalism don't really have the chance to do that like during our like PhDs per se, or during our traditional like science training careers. Unless you're like going way out of your way to do so. And so now that we're shifting into like around like 11:48, I want to make sure that we're covering like the area of like essentially like portfolio building, like building your career, like some advice for like early career writers and communicators. So essentially the question kind of is like, what kinds of advice would you give for folks who are trying to like break in? Like, how do you find those opportunities to try out different styles of science communication or like news journalism? How do you like find the time like outside of everything that's happening in the world to self-reflect and like know what works for you stylistically and like topic wise, etc. That's like 12 different questions in one. But I'll start. I think we can start with Chiungwei, and then I think in my head I'm like, okay, so Maddie, I feel like you're the most seasoned, or like you've been working in news for the longest. Or I think, or actually no, never mind. That timeline doesn't make sense to me.
Yeah, no, it's just
Anyway.
it's just that I've made that transition recently, is what you're thinking. Yeah.
I was like,
but Chiungwei, go for it, Chiungwei.
But yeah, Chiungwei can start, and then I think maybe after Chiungwei answers, like Andrea, Maddie, whoever feels more comfortable jumping in, like.
Yeah, for sure. Well, I would like to answer this question kind of from my experience. I see myself there's a different time, because you change, your lifestyle change, and your thoughts will change as well. So in my earlier PhD transition, earlier PhD period, it's like more like because you're in school, there are tons of resources, and there will be free resources, and there will be workshop you can apply to. There will be training you can try. I think my suggestion would be just try as much as you can without getting yourself overwhelmed. So fine, if that's overwhelmed, then that's not work for you. Either the communication style or just the pace of it. I think that's very important for you to be comfortable with the things you are doing. So for me, I just reach out to, like I say, science communication club writing group in my university, and from there you can start to collect more information. You talk to this person has other experience and opportunity, and you write about this, and you find out another institution that you can write for. So I would like you to think about starting from one point, and that point will just bloom at some point, even though you don't see that at a very short time. But in the end, you will see that. And so that mindset kind of brings me and continues to stay with me, even though when I'm now as a full-time scientist in corporate area. So that's a 9 to 5, no, not to 5, 9 to 5, 8 to 5. So that's a very long period of time. And I still want to stay with the community because I just love writing. I love to learning more about science. So, but I don't have many capacity in doing that. So I'm trying to assess where I can plug in. Okay, networking, like I said, starting from one point, and you learn more about editor and other institutions, and there'll be some opportunity coming to your way very slowly. But again, be patient with that. Be patient with your curiosity, but also be patient with your network. So, and then time by time, you'll find that that's very important, and just starting small and continue building up that. If one thing doesn't work for you, let it go. You have tons of opportunity. There's abundance opportunity out there, and keep doing what you're doing, because we, in science communication area, I think we need all kinds of science communicator, all kinds of format, all kinds of diversity, all kinds of background thinking. That will make the field just better.
I wish Chiungwei was around talking to me when I was in graduate school. Yes, I love that. Try as many things. But the more important thing than trying a bunch of things is not getting married to any of them. Like, I went to a museum and I was like, I think I'm going to be a museum person. And then a kid was like, I hate your shoes and you're stupid. And I was like, wow, I can't do this. I can't handle this. Like, I would rather. So there are like certain routes that I would suggest. So if you decide like, I'm here because I want to be a journalist, you've already done you're like pretty set on that. That program that I built at NPR that's at BU is specifically focused on helping scientists get published outside of academia. And that is one of the biggest hurdles, because a lot of these internship programs are very difficult. Like, Chiungwei got into the AAAS Mass Media Fellowship, I think you were saying last year, and you have been writing for years and years. So these are the types of people that they're accepting. So I would go through a science communication program like the SciCommers and try and get your first like byline. And that's really important. And then use that as it's like one little step at a time. Finding your first byline, applying to the AAAS Mass Media Fellowship a couple of times has been really successful. Like Katie Wu, who's one of my favorite science writers. I remember she came through my program and is now like winning awards over at the Atlantic. So, there are some like don't try to reinvent anything, because there are so many science communication programs now that are built around you. And so it's a lot of what Chiungwei said, a lot of like networking within these communities. I am obviously partial to the SciCommers program because I helped build it, but that's a program that's like for collaborating, for networking, and for eventually writing.
Yeah, I would say, there's so many different styles of writing. So like, I mean, Twitter's sort of crashing and burning right now, but the alternatives like Blue Sky, I know there's a really active science feed on Blue Sky. Looking at how people that are really active on there are, how they communicate what they're doing and what their science communication is. Reading is as much a part of learning this as writing, because you have to figure out what are the styles you like? What are the types of people, you're to figure out how people do what they do in journalism. Reading can be really, really instructive. Paying attention to how a story is told. And I think that's a really low bar of entry area to just sort of try talking about things. And yeah, I agree that some of these programs that really help sort of intro people from science into journalism are really, really helpful. And it doesn't have to be, the formal way I went of, going to get a master's, although everyone in my program came for like, I really like science, but don't actually want to be a working scientist. I want to write about it instead. I think the AAAS fellowship is great. We actually host a fellow every year at SciAm. And I think several of our staff members have been former fellows, and many of them often freelance for us. It's harder, but you can cold pitch places if you have an idea. And we actually, SIAM is a little unique in this, in that we don't just have journalism, we also have expert written pieces. We have features in the magazine. Most of our features are actually written by experts, not journalists. But we also have a very active op-ed section. Sometimes those are more strict opinions, sometimes they're a little more analysis, but we run we run many of them from people at all out, like through all stages of their scientific careers. And so we're always particularly interested in having early career scientists write for us, because you get really interesting perspectives that way. And I know other places like The Conversation runs pieces from scientists, and I think there are a few others, but those can be kind of other routes to explore too.
Now that we're shifting into the last 5 minutes or so, before we open it up for audience questions, I'd like to ask the three of you if you feel comfortable dropping whatever like you feel like the most or your preferred way of contacting you for anyone who's like interested in following up and asking questions about career, like how you do your work or any other questions. So yeah.
Yeah, I'm totally fine with if anyone can email me at my SIAM email address. That's totally fine. Yeah, it's publicly available.
Yeah, I'm trying. You can yeah, just find me on Twitter. Honestly, it's still probably the fastest way to get to me.
I'm just typing it into the chat. But if anyone would like to like unmute themselves and ask a question, feel free to do so. I'm scrolling through the chat right now. Earlier, I saw there was a question about portfolio building, and so I kind of tried to work that into the last question. But we have some, yeah, so the previous question above that was about, oh, actually, like how different it is communicating science to different age groups. And so maybe we can also like broaden that question to talk about like, I guess how, like, actually, I would actually be curious as to like, what kinds of factors do you feel like make the biggest difference when you're thinking about your audience? So like, is it age? Is it like the demographic, like where you're like, whether you're like communicating at like a national versus like local audience, like what people's like backgrounds are, like what kinds of factors like play the biggest parts in like how you would change your writing to your audience?
I will say, to address the age thing, writing for kids is really, that's the hardest writing I've ever done, because you have to write it really short. And distilling a study down into 150 words, so hard. It's so hard. And you have to define words kind of as you go. Like herpetologist, comma, a person who studies frogs, that was by far the hardest writing I've ever done. And it's really, really great. People who can do it are exceptionally talented, and I'm so glad that they exist. We at SIAM, we're, the vast majority of our audience is based in the US. So we tend to make a lot of decisions based on whether people in the US will read a story. And unfortunately, Americans as a group, as a very broad group, aren't always super interested in things happening not in the US. Obviously there are very specific situations where where there is interest, but talking about an environmental problem in another country, it's just not going to get a lot of views, or you have to figure out a different way to sort of tell it, explain how it relates to a similar problem in the US. It is one of my biggest frustrations is sort of getting, just getting stories that I think are important and that we want to tell the audience they deserve. We do a lot of sometimes in terms of if you're targeting different age groups, honestly, one of the biggest things is what medium you're telling it in. Most Gen Zers and stuff get much more of their news from social media, from TikTok, from things like that, than from going to a website or opening a print magazine. So we, in particular, have started to think a lot about maybe how to take the same story that was a new online news story and tell it in a TikTok format to reach a different audience. And we actually launched our TikTok in August, I think. I haven't been on it yet because I am an old. It's a little it's a little foreign to me, but that is definitely something we think a lot about in terms of how to reach a broader audience, in terms of broader age group, more diverse, that kind of thing.
Yeah, I can talk a little bit about this because we were specifically, so newsrooms have this issue, and I'll try to be succinct about it, but I could talk about it for hours, which is that science communicates. So people don't make decisions based on facts, generally speaking. So a lot of science writers are like, here's facts, often because that's the way journalism has been for a really long time. But we know that scientists and journalists and all people make decisions based on their identity, their previous experiences, who they are, how they're situated in the world. Do I wish that doing a 5-part series called Smack Fact on spiders, where people to come and talk smack about how cool spiders are to other biologists, would make you love spiders? Yes, I do. But I know that's not actually how it works. I tried it. So the reality is, newsrooms have to make money, which is what Andrea was kind of talking about. And so you want to target as large of an audience as possible. But the reality is there is no one large general audience. So what we would do, if I'm at NPR and I have an overwhelmingly white, cis, heterosexual audience, and I want to reach other people, is that I talk specifically to the people that I want to talk to. So I'm not at NPR. I wasn't trying to necessarily keep the same audience. I was trying to change it. And the only way that I have found to do that is to bring in people that are experts who have lived experience in that field and to tell you who the audience is. So for example, I do a lot of reporting on trans health and HRT and how to start hormone replacement therapy. And the way that we targeted our audience and said, hey, this episode is for trans folks interested in medical transitioning. If you don't know what that stuff is, here's some links in our bio. But as soon as I explain like what a transition is, my audience, if I'm a trans person, I'm already lost. I'm already gone. I'm like, this isn't for me. I already know what this is. You know what I mean? It would be like a graduate's going into a graduate student place and be like, the most important thing about graduate school is finding the free food. Like, we know that. You know that. You obviously, like, you have to sometimes tell the audience who they are in order to target a specific audience. And so you can actually just explicitly say, this episode is for folks that are worried about how to gather for Thanksgiving safely for COVID. These are for folks that want to transition. These are for like, folks in South Carolina that are experiencing flooding. So often you can just tell your audience who you're talking to directly. The trick is then sometimes, as a news organization, you lose some money in that process, which I'm fine with, but big organizations aren't.
Yeah, that's a good one. And I kind of want to bring another aspect where science communication, the skill you earned in newsroom, in writing, because you're a scientist and in your early career, if you're thinking about like talking to science policy maker, these decision makers, and like me, I'm in my industry and I do science as my daily work, but a lot of time we still combine or relate it to the business side of that. So company want to make money, but making money is not my priority, it's not my interest, but I want to if I want to continue to kind of communicate the importance of the research I'm doing, I still need to take some learning about their language. And because when I think about age, I usually think about this senior manager. They are like 40, 50 years old, male, white, and they have been doing things for a while. They know what they're doing, but they don't necessarily. And I don't, as an identity, I'm a woman of color, foreigner, and the identity is just different. Who am I to talk to them? So it's kind of learning what's their language and specifically what they care about, and then integrate that need with my ask. I ask you to take serious about this science. This is the fact, this is the data, and this product just doesn't work. All kind of things. But they probably wouldn't believe that if you don't put the language and put you into their shoes, so they can understand it. Then both parties can start talk. So science communication, great important skill set can be used in many different ways. So I hope that our conversation with Andrea and with Maddie can encourage you to continue to do what you're doing now.
Yeah, it's currently 12:05, so thank you so much for everyone who stayed a little bit longer. Oh, there is one more question in the chat, but I think we can stop the recording. If folks need to hop off, feel free to do so. But yeah, thank you all so much for being here. Was really excited to get the chance to talk to you, all of you. And thank you all so much to the audience for participating. And please, oh yeah, Anastasia, would you like to talk about our upcoming event next week?
Yes, yes. Again, thank you so much to our panelists. Like, fascinating. I love this all. Really spectacular. For anyone on here who has really appreciated what they said and they want to take that next step, NSPN is going to launch a writer's room pilot for the next year. So we're going to host a town hall next Friday at noon ET time. And if you want to be a writer and get that habitual practice, get a community going, feel like you're surrounded by this kind of language and getting this sense of networking and skill building and portfolio building. This is really the intention and the goal behind it. So please join us. And yeah, again, I'm so grateful for everyone who's joined today and spoke today. Thank you so much.